Thursday, and I decided that I wanted to do a little book read for anybody out there who wants to hear a book read of a book that we don't hear about a lot anymore, but it's an amazing book. It's called The Little House. The Little House. And so I'd like to read it to you and encourage you also not to forget to go to the library this summer, and if you don't have a library card, get one and join the reading program, because reading is fun and can take you to all new places. Okay, so this is called The Little House by Virginia Lee Burton, and it's Throwback Thursday because this was even written in 1942, a year before my dad was born. Okay, so there's a picture of the little house. Once upon a time, there was a little house way out in the country. She was a pretty little house, and she was strong and well built. The man who built her so well said, "The little house shall never be sold for gold or silver, and she will live to see our great-great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren living in her." The little house. She was very happy, and she sat on a hill, and she watched the countryside around her. She watched the sunrise in the morning, and she watched the sunset in the evening. Day followed day, each one a little different from the one before. But the little house, she stayed just the same. And there she is, happy on her hill. In the nights, she watched the moon grow from a thin new moon to a full moon, and then back again to an old moon. And when there was no moon, she watched the stars. Way off in the distance, she could see the lights of the city. The little house was curious about the city, and she wondered what it would be like to live there. Time passed quickly for the little house. She watched the countryside slowly change with the seasons. In the spring, when the days grew longer and the sun warmer, she waited for the first robin. She watched the grass turn green. She watched the buds on the trees swell and the apple trees burst into blossom. She watched the children playing in the brook. In the long summer days, she sat in the sun and watched the trees cover themselves with leaves and the white daisies cover the hill. She watched the gardens grow, and she watched the apples turn red and ripen, and she watched the children who were swimming in the pool. In the fall, when the days grew shorter and the nights colder, she watched the first frost, and the leaves turned to bright yellow and orange and red. She watched the harvest gathered and the apples picked, and she watched the children going back to school. In the winter, when the nights were long and the days were short and the countryside covered with snow, she watched the children coasting and skating. Year followed year, and the apple trees grew old and new ones were planted. The children grew up and they went away to the city. And now at night, the lights of the city seemed brighter and closer. One day, the little house was surprised to see a horseless carriage coming down the winding country road, and pretty soon there were more of them, and the road and fewer carriages pulled horses. Pretty soon along came some surveyors and surveyed the land in front of the little house. Pretty soon along came steam shovels and dug up the road through the hill covered with daisies. Then some trucks came and dumped big stones on the road. And then some trucks with little stones, and some trucks with tar and sand, and finally a steamroller came and rolled it smooth, and the road was done. Now, the little house watched the trucks and automobiles going back and forth to the city. Gasoline stations, roadside stands, and small houses followed the new road. Everyone and everything moves much faster now than it did before. More roads were made, and the countryside was divided into lots. More houses and bigger houses, apartment houses and tenement houses. Schools, stores, and garages spread over the land and crowded over the little house. No one wanted to live in her and take care of her anymore, and she couldn't be sold for gold or silver, so she just stayed there and watched. You can see her right in the middle there of everything around her. Now it was not so quiet and peaceful at night. Now the lights of the city were bright and very close, and the street lights shone all night. This must be living in the city, thought the little house, and didn't know whether she liked it or not. She missed the field of daisies and the apple trees dancing in the moonlight. Pretty soon, there were trolley cars going back and forth in front of the little house. And all day and all night, they'd go back and forth. Everyone seemed to be so busy, and everyone seemed to be in such a hurry. Pretty soon, there was an elevated train going back and forth in front of the little house, and the air was filled with dust and smoke, and the noise was so loud. And it shook the little house. Now she couldn't tell when spring came or summer or fall or winter. They all seemed the same. Can you even find the little house in this picture? She's so tiny. Pretty soon there was a subway going back and forth underneath the little house, and she couldn't see it, but she could feel and hear it. People were moving faster and faster. No one noticed the little house anymore. They hurried by without a glance. Didn't even look at her. Pretty soon, they tore down the apartment houses and tenement buildings around the little house and started digging big cellars, one on each side. The steam shovels dug down 3 stories on one side and 4 stories on the other. Pretty soon, they started building up. They built up 25 stories on one side and 35 on the other. Now the little house only saw the sun at noon and didn't see the moon or the stars at night at all because the lights of the city were too bright. And she didn't like living in the city. At night, she used to dream of the country and the field of daisies and the apple trees dancing in the moonlight. The little house was very sad and lonely. Her paint was cracked and dirty. Her windows were broken and her shutters hung crookedly. She looked shabby, though she was just as good a house as she ever was underneath. Then one fine morning in spring, along came the great-great-granddaughter of the man who built the little house so well. She saw the little shabby house, but she didn't hurry by. There was something about the little house that made her stop and look again. She said to her husband, "The little house is just like the little house my grandmother lived in when she was a little girl. Only that little house was out in the country, on a hill covered with daisies and apple trees growing all around her." They found out it was the same house. So they went to the movers to see if they could move the little house. And the movers looked at the little house all over and said, "Sure, this house is as good as ever. She's built so well, we could move her anywhere." So they jacked up the little house and put her on wheels. Traffic was held up for hours as they slowly moved her out of the city. At first, the little house was frightened, but after she got used to it, she rather liked it. They rolled along big roads and rolled along little roads until they were way out in the country. When the little house saw the green grass and heard the birds singing, she didn't feel sad anymore. They went along and along, but they couldn't seem to find just the right place. They tried the little house here and they tried the little house there. Finally, they saw a little hill in the middle of a field and apple trees growing all around. "There," said the great-great-granddaughter, "that's just the place." "Yes, it is," said the little house to herself. A cellar was dug on top of the hill, and slowly they moved the house from the road to the hill. And I kind of like the words on this page too, because it looks like the road that she traveled. The windows and shutters were fixed, and once again they painted her a lovely shade of pink. As the little house settled down in her new foundation, she smiled happily. Once again, she could watch the sun and moon and stars, and once again, she could watch the spring and summer and fall and winter come and go. Once again, she was lived in and taken care of. Never again would she be curious about the city. Never again would she want to live there. The stars twinkled above her and a new moon was coming up. It was spring. All was quiet and peaceful in the country. And that's the story of the little house. And I hope you will be reading lots of books this summer.